Helen, what is your book background?
Well, I thought I would start by saying I'm coming to everybody tonight live from inside the National Library of Scotland's Gutenberg Bible. That's what this image is. The number of people who say to me, "Are you inside a manuscript?" I think to the fantabulousness of Gutenberg's printing and ability to emulate a manuscript.
Now you truly are marginalia. You are living marginalia.
I like that concept. So I think we have 47 people here. I'm expecting that maybe some more people will join us, but we're already a couple of minutes past our start time. So I think I am going to declare our proceedings open for the evening. And I'll start off by introducing myself to those who don't know me. I'm Helen Vincent. I'm head of Rare Books, Maps and Music at the National Library of Scotland and also Vice President of the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society and your virtual host for this evening. And hugely excited to introduce to you for the first time in Edinburgh Bibliographical Society history, a speaker coming to us live from around the world. Normally we have our meetings in Edinburgh, and as you can see, I will just tell our audience, because I know we have some newcomers here who have probably never attended an Edinburgh Bibliographical Society meeting before. The Edinburgh Bibliographical Society is the oldest society in the world, which is a bibliographical society promoting the study of books and manuscripts. And we were founded in 1890 in Edinburgh. That is where we have always had our meetings, generally live in person. At the moment, we are taking advantage of the terrible situation that we're in around the world with COVID-19. Since we're having online meetings, one of the great things about that is we can have a host as well as speaker, as well as guests coming from all over the place. So welcome to Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. To those of you who would never otherwise attend us, we have a fantastic program of talks like everybody else around the world. Also, our next couple will be by Zoom. One in, let me check, yes, 21st of January, Kirsty Blair, professor at Strathclyde University, will be talking about local all over the world, Scottish writing and the popular newspaper press. And on the 18th of February, our speaker will be Jamie Reid Baxter, whom I can actually see in our attendees this evening, who is going to speak about Esther Ingall's A Franco-Scottish Glory of Jacobean Scotland. And after that, like everybody else again, we're playing it by ear as to when we will resume our meetings in person and how long we will continue to have meetings online. So I will also encourage you to join our society. It's a very reasonable membership fee for which you get our Edinburgh Bibliographical Society journal. If you ever write on anything to do with Scottish bibliography, the history of the book in Scotland, we welcome articles and submissions for a journal. We also have a GP Johnson Prize for early career and postgraduate researchers for the best articles submitted for that prize, which may be published in the journal as an article. So how to find out more about all these exciting things and how to become a member, please do visit our website, edinburghbibliographical.society.org.uk. And now that introduction being over, I'm going to move on to introduce our speaker, Alexandra Alvis. And Ali is the Special Collections Reference Librarian of the Smithsonian Libraries, who obtained her first master's degree from Edinburgh University in Material Culture and History of the Book, and her second in Information Management and Digital Preservation from the University of Glasgow. So even though she's now located elsewhere, she's got this strong Scottish connection, which is why we thought she would be a great speaker for us. Both of her dissertations for her 2 master's degrees dealt with the history of bookbinding with a focus on the rebinding of manuscripts. Ali has published widely on a variety of topics, including the use of social media to communicate special collections, the history of a specific set of English printers' ornaments, and the occurrence of arsenic pigments in bookbindings. And she's also very active on social media, maintaining popular book history-based accounts on Instagram and Twitter. And you'll see her Twitter handle in her presentation this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Ali, who is going to speak on Illumination of the Page and of the Spirit, manuscript books of the hours as windows. And just before I do, I'm going to say that if you would like to ask questions, please do use the chat function, and we'll review them at the end, and I'm sure Ali will be happy to respond to anything you care to say. Please do make sure that your microphone is muted, and also to improve the connection that your camera is turned off. Thank you. Over to you, Ali.
All right, well, welcome to this online lecture. I am honored that the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society deemed me appropriate to speak to you about this very interesting topic. Just a quick side note, I think on Tuesday, the Smithsonian Libraries announced that we are now the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. So you will see that logo down at the bottom of my slides. We recently integrated with the Smithsonian Institution Archives, so now we have all sorts of new collections and new colleagues. So coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and here we go. Illuminated manuscripts are some of the most beautiful and dynamic objects to survive from the Middle Ages. In his autobiography, Praeterita, artist and art historian John Ruskin refers to the Illuminated Book of Hours as a fairy cathedral full of painted windows. Unlike intricate medieval jewelry or ornamented chalices, manuscripts like these are still used in nearly the same way as when they were new. They are held, their pages are turned, their illuminations are considered sequentially. While many of us are used to seeing these treasures inside glass boxes, out of reach of curious fingers, researchers and librarians regularly use these fascinating artifacts. Far from just being pretty faces, illuminated manuscripts can inform how we understand medieval social history, the art of bookmaking, and the history of religious devotion, among other things. Like their book form, made with motion in mind, the beautiful and enduring iconography in these manuscripts is not and never has been static. Medieval users viewed their relationship to illuminated religious manuscripts as a two-way street, more like a window than a flat image. Understanding how medieval people dynamically interacted with illuminated religious manuscripts physically and ideologically is the main topic of this lecture. But it is also important to note how that dynamism has carried on to the present day. So before we get into the meat of the lecture, we can go over a few sort of manuscript anatomy points and vocabulary words that I will be using throughout. So what is a manuscript and what makes it different from the printed books that you might have on your shelf? Historian Christopher de Hamel calls the medieval manuscript the most common whole object to come down to us from the Middle Ages. The key definition of manuscript is right there in the name. It comes from Latin manu for by hand and scriptus meaning written. So it's literally a book that is handwritten. Although anything written by hand can be called a manuscript, we are largely looking at manuscripts in the codex format. As opposed to a scroll or deed or loose sheets, the codex format is the thing we think of when we think of a bound book. The most basic definition of a codex is multiple pages sewn or glued together. Codices are more efficient to use and navigate than scrolls. Obviously, scrolls require two hands at all times to use, and they don't have page numbers, so flipping back and forth is almost impossible. Next, what is a miniature? You hear that word a lot when it comes to illuminated manuscripts, but it doesn't just refer to the size of an illustration. It comes from the Latin word miniare, to color with minium, which is a pigment made of red lead. Generally, miniature refers to the contained scenes in a manuscript, but it can also refer to more complex initials. And what makes it illuminated? Well, there are two schools of thought. The most classic definition is the use of gold or silver leaf in the illuminations make it illuminated because they catch the light and they twinkle. but historian Michelle P. Brown calls illumination the use of luminous colors. I find it difficult not to classify something like the Lindisfarne Gospels as an illuminated manuscript, so I am firmly in the luminous color camp. Finally, what is medieval? This is something that people will argue about for pages and pages and pages, but for the purpose of this talk, I will say that the period lasts from roughly the 5th century to around 1450, although many of the manuscripts mentioned in this lecture are from the high, quote unquote, Middle Ages, which lasted from around the year 1000 to around the year 1347. This intersects with general population booms and normal climate to the Black Plague and the Little Ice Age. The later Middle Ages comes between 1347 and 1450. So the Middle Ages are generally defined to start with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and end with Gutenberg's invention of movable type. The lines are blurry though. This was not like a switch being flicked on and off. Medieval traditions, particularly in bookmaking, carried on into many later centuries. In a time before print and paper, options for communicating were oral or manuscript. Many genres of manuscript existed beyond religious texts, and many were illuminated, including classical literature, medical works, bestiaries, and even hunting guides. But illuminations in religious manuscripts were particularly heavy with meaning for medieval readers. Once only the domain of the clergy, medieval manuscripts became more widely accessible by the end of the High Middle Ages, thanks in part to the demand of the nobility. It would be difficult to use a missal or a breviary, both structured for liturgical use, in personal devotion. The classic image of monks in cloisters toiling over a manuscript would be accurate for until around the mid-13th century. But as demands by nobility and later the middle classes grew, manuscript production was divided among professional artisans, from scribes and rubricators to illuminators like Simon Benning here. These personal manuscripts were first for use in the personal chapels of the nobility, then for day-to-day use by the middle class. Thanks to both the rise of the middle class and the rise of literacy, manuscripts became more widespread by the later Middle Ages than they ever had been before. So what kind of religious books were medieval people reading? Most books outside religious works were way beyond the means of even the wealthier medieval people. The most common surviving medieval manuscript is the Book of Hours, the bestseller of the Middle Ages. But the Book of Hours did not spring into being as a fully formed genre. Rather, they were distilled from complex religious manuscripts, such as missals and breviaries, intended for a very limited audience. Such works were meant to be used in a liturgical setting and contained specific texts structured according to church authority. A missal was a grand, large book used by priests for, among other things, the reading of Mass, while the smaller breviary was a required possession for monks and nuns and included the Psalms, hymns, and the Hours of the Virgin. The missing link between these strictly liturgical texts and the lay Book of Hours is the Psalter. This book was originally a component of the breviary, and psalters began to be produced as independent books in the 12th century. They generally resembled a Book of Hours in their contents, apart from the fact that they also contained all 150 psalms. This more compact group of texts became popular among the nobility and aristocracy, some of whom had dispensation from the Pope to maintain private chapels in their homes. In order to facilitate ease of use, the Psalter was further reduced and the Book of Hours was born. Books of Hours always contain the Hours of the Virgin, and as the name implies, these were prayers meant to be said at different times of the day and night. But they also offered a lot of opportunities for personalization. They always included a calendar which highlighted regional feasts and saints' days, and they could also include cycles about your name saint, and many books of hours made for female patrons included the Hours of St. Catherine. They could even include you if you had the money, and we will touch more on commissioners' portraits later in this presentation. At around the cost of 43 days of skilled labor or 3 cows, books of hours were still unattainably expensive to most, and they continue to be that way today. If you want to shell out 6 figures for a manuscript book of hours, be my guest. I wish that I could, but maybe one day. So now let's get into the anatomy of the illuminated page. Moving from the outside in, early manuscripts had empty white borders, perfect for note-taking. But this is a topic for another day. So let's start with the text. The visual elements on this page were seen as less than the text, although not by a lot. The scribe worked first in the vast majority of cases and left space for the illuminations. Some medieval writers implied that looking at miniatures was just as important and even performed the same function as reading the text word for word. Illuminations were meant to work in tandem with the text. One could not be properly read without the other. Readers oriented themselves within the text using oversized, sometimes ornamental initials. These served as guideposts in a time before text formatting as we knew it. Without these initials, readers were faced with an unbroken wall of text. The simplest embellished initials were rubricated rather than illuminated. The word rubricate comes from the Latin rubrico, which means to color red. There was then a hierarchy of style and complexity for passage, section, chapter, book, etc. And some of these went above and beyond the call of duty, such as the opening page of the Book of Kells, where the initial takes up the whole page. Now let's move to the border. This is one of the most curious places in a medieval religious manuscript, and in the later Middle Ages, it could get pretty crowded with all sorts of flora and fauna. But this lavish decoration had a somewhat humble beginning. In France, some initials began to sprout decorative vines that grew into the empty space around the text. The rest, as they say, is history. The border is both a literal and figurative margin, sometimes featuring figures that were outside of grace. Role inversions and odd interactions emphasized that this space was outside the holy domain of the text. The border was the world of the profane, and that is where everyday life met the world of the holy, and it was an inherently liminal space. It was also a space for illuminators to innovate and have fun. These are some of my favorite marginal illustrations. This one from the Library of Congress with this, I don't know if it's a dog or a cat or a rabbit, with a man on a leash. And then this Book of Hours from the University of Edinburgh with the strange bird hybrids. It seems like there's no end to the creativity you can find in medieval margins. Trompe-l'oeil was a popular feature of these borders, particularly in the later Middle Ages and in the early modern period. Artists drew plants, insects, and other animals from direct observation, rather than copying from an exemplar, as was very popular in the early Middle Ages. These trompe-l'oeil borders actually are some of the earliest quote-unquote natural history illustrations. Because they were drawn from direct observation, you get a lot more detail that you might not get in sort of a more classical illustration of animals or plants. Owner cameos were one of many ways of personalizing manuscripts. These can either appear in the border, entreating the holy figures to allow them into grace, or actually taking part in the scene, as this fellow is here. These owner portraits were still confined to the realm of more expensive books. A Book of Hours purchased by the average merchant family would be surprisingly cookie cutter. Pattern books existed for miniatures and decorations, and this kind of production kept costs low for the middle classes. Finally, we come to the miniature. Books of Hours and other religious manuscripts were understood to have a dynamism about them, acting as both literal and figurative windows to the holy. Going back to the Ruskin quote I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, in his autobiography published in 1885, Ruskin states that a truly well-illuminated missal is a fairy cathedral full of painted windows. Here he uses missal to refer to illuminated manuscripts broadly, but his charming imagery is at once fanciful and literal when talking about books of hours. It is easy to draw physical comparisons between the form of an illuminated miniature and a stained glass window, but their metaphysical similarities may not be so clear. Suger, the 12th century abbot of Saint-Denis, justified the costly stained glass windows of his church by describing how the light illuminating the multicolored panes would figuratively illuminate the minds of his parishioners. This statement reflects the medieval concept that stained glass windows transmit the divine light of God, making normally imperceptible light visible by causing it to pass through the colored glass. In the same way, miniatures in books of hours functioned as windows through which the light of the holy could flow out of the book and directly into the eyes of the user, but also for their users to peer into a sacred reality outside time and space as they understood it. Both the illuminators and the users of books of hours understood this metaphor deeply, and the visual cues in the miniatures followed the concept. The majority of miniatures are not just simple squares, but feature a curved vault at the top, such as this miniature from the Hours of Mary of Burgundy with a particularly detailed border, actually featuring Mary herself reading the book that this miniature appears in. It's very meta. Others are literally situated inside of architectural window frames, a motif that continued into printed books of hours. Such a direct, personal, and portable avenue to God, the Virgin, and various saints allowed lay people to plead for holy intercession whenever and wherever they could access their books of hours. Catherine A. Smith describes how medieval people conceived of the past, present, and future in terms of Christian salvation history. The present in which they lived was the time of the Second Coming and the end of the world, preceded by Old and New Testament time. The illuminations in books of hours were conduits through which time could resonate directly with readers by encouraging them to emotionally identify with the main players in past and future biblical events, an act which could be intensified through personalization. Indeed, the Book of Hours itself, even outside of its illuminations, is a temporal entity, a visual object that must be experienced through time as a reader turns pages. This kind of temporal engagement meant that even if readers browsed the book non-sequentially, the structure through which isolated elements could be understood was always present. This is another beautiful miniature from the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, depicting, again, a literal window into the crucifixion of Christ. And again, the book itself sitting in front of the window, making a direct connection between the event and the object. The shapes of many miniatures reinforce their function as windows. Their vaulted frames and architectural elements can resemble the grand windows of churches, or even church doors for another sort of metaphor. Medieval people physically interacted with their books of hours in a variety of ways as well. Some medieval readers actually physically touched or kissed their manuscripts, venerating the figures depicted. It was an example of how the line between a book and actual divine presence was very blurry, much like how these miniatures have become blurry after centuries of lips touching them. On the opposite end of the spectrum from kissing and touching, in order to show a true rejection of the influence of the devil, users would sometimes deface images emblematic of evil, such as the beast here in this manuscript from the University of Glasgow. You can see that someone has actually struck through it with a knife. Today we see illumination-inspired motifs on everything from fashion to home decor to wrapping paper. The medieval period is also an enduring theme in movies and TV shows, although their understanding of manuscript aesthetics can be a little lacking. This is what's called remediation, in which new media transforms older media, retaining some of the original aspects and discarding others. Thanks to ongoing digitization projects, medieval manuscripts are now more accessible than ever before, and their images are easy to download and quote-unquote remix. This loss of context, though, is perhaps nowhere more tragic than as exemplified by modern alt-right movements. Rather than understanding the Middle Ages as the cross-cultural melting pot that they were, people in these movements have a fantasy about a racially pure period that never existed. Knights, particularly the Knights Templar and Crusaders, are popular among followers of alt-right movements, as they are seen as military resistance to an outside, non-white, non-Christian threat. In reality, the Crusades were an issue of wealth and land ownership as much as a holy mission, but again, that is a topic for another talk. This misunderstanding is thanks in part to 18th and 19th century scholars using their racial biases to write certain groups out of history, partly as justification for ongoing European colonialism. Remediation is nothing new, although it is unfortunate it is so easy to separate the original materials from its context today. But people have been reinterpreting and misunderstanding manuscripts for a long time. The invention of movable type did not stop the manuscript tradition in its tracks. Early books are very much a synthesis of manuscript formatting and print innovations. You can see another example of this behind Helen Vincent with the Gutenberg Bible, where those initials are put in by hand. And this is a further example. Until the early 16th century, many decorative elements of printed books were still added by hand, such as rubrication and ornamental initials. Illustrations were also enlivened by hand to make them appear illuminated. It was mostly just sort of coloring in sort of the lines, inside of the lines. Until the mid-16th century, manuscript books of hours were still more popular than the printed ones. But the art style of particularly the early Middle Ages was very much out of fashion and is seen as naive compared to the advances being made in perspective and portraiture. You can get a sense of this when comparing miniatures and paintings from the mid to late 15th century. I will go back one just to show there is an effort being made at perspective here, although the bed of the Christ child is a little bit angular, strange angles, and it doesn't quite match up with the perspective of the room. Meanwhile, this is a masterclass in perspective, which is added to by the use of the gridded ground there. In the 18th to 19th century period, most manuscripts from the early Middle Ages, and even many from the High Middle Ages, were considered to be, quote, crude and monkish. But other manuscripts, particularly the high-quality ones made for the nobility or extremely rich, were desirable to collectors, no matter what the cost. In the 18th century, the practice of cutting miniatures and decorative initials out of books to sell them was established, and it really took off in the 19th century. John Ruskin himself was a notorious manuscript butcher, although he claimed who had little care for the manuscripts as objects. This ghastly practice has a slight upside. Some manuscripts survive as fragments today that would not have survived at all as whole books. And it means more people have access to this kind of history, especially in collections that have been established relatively recently. We live in fast-paced and tumultuous times where history is easily robbed of its context in order to be presented as easy to interpret bite-sized chunks. The beautiful illuminations in medieval manuscript books of hours can easily fall prey to this decontextualization, resulting in at best mild befuddlement and at worst fuel for modern hate groups. It is impossible to cover all the ins and outs of books of hours in this short lecture. I didn't even get to talk about my favorite parts, which are the bindings, but I hope this will encourage you to learn more about these multifaceted objects. And as a librarian, I hope this learning will involve going into a rare book reading room when all of this pandemic stuff is over and actually handling a manuscript yourself. So thank you all for attending today. I really appreciate it, and it has been so wonderful to see so many people pop in from the waiting room, and I will open it up for questions.
Thanks very much, Ali, for that really wonderful canter through some really fascinating manuscripts. And I've got to say, I've think about illuminations. I've never thought about looking at the frames within the illuminations, and now I will be attentive to those. I encourage people to put questions into the chat. That's how we're going to do our Q&A. But while we're waiting for some questions to pop up, I will claim the introducer's privilege of asking the first question. So thinking about this frame thing, it's something that always interests me, is the neurological experience of reading and whether or not people think they are looking at an illusion or looking at a real thing, what is going on inside your brain while you're reading. And I guess when you're talking about this being a window through to a spiritual experience, I started to think about, is this like what we experience when we're watching television? Am I watching reality or am I watching pixels on the screen? Am I looking at reality or am I looking at an illumination? And I wonder if you could talk about what you think the experience of the medieval reader would be looking at through these windows.
Yeah, let me pop back to the Mary of Burgundy, the first Mary of Burgundy miniature, because that is just, it is a stunning example of sort of the act of reading sort of caught in situ there. Medieval people sort of understood things taken in through the eyes not as going to your brain, but as going to your heart. So when they looked at a religious miniature, they were sort of taking that wholly into their heart, which I always thought was interesting. And I don't know that they sort of had quite the concept that we have now of, you know, this isn't real. Everything was a bit more literal back then, even for scientists. While they did understand that, you know, a book is an object, it's not physically Jesus. You did have, well, you still have things like communion, where the bread is figuratively the body and the wine is the blood. So it's transubstantiation in bibliographic form, which is interesting. I know sometimes when I watch something on TV or in the movies, it takes me a bit to sort of get into the mode of forgetting where you are and that you're watching this on a TV, and to, you know, get really involved with the story. And I think that was part of the medieval reading experience, that, you know you are sitting in your window, opening up your book of the Book of Hours to read the prayer that happens at this time of the day, every day. And it's getting into the mindset and really attuning yourself and considering closely the illuminations, which really acted as an enhancement to the text. We all know that we can get very involved in novels and we can't put them down, and we stay up really late at night just flying through them. But with the images in illuminated manuscripts, the fact that the books of hours were made to be read every single day, you would get used to the text. You would read it out loud every day. You might even sort of subconsciously memorize some of it. So having that image there, it really sort of forces you to think harder about what you're doing. especially things that are so detailed like this Mary of Burgundy hours. It's just, every time I look at it, I find something new. And I can't imagine what a medieval person looking at this would have thought. It really brings the concept of the prayers and the figures involved in the religious stories. It brings it into a more personal orbit. It's not something that, you know, the kings and queens are off doing and you have no involvement with it. This is something that you personally are doing. You are interacting with this book. So yeah.
There are lots of questions, so I'm going to move to taking some of the ones that are in the chat. And the first question is from our society president, in fact. But it is the chronologically first question. I'm not just taking her first because she's our president. From Elizabeth Formby Lawrence, John Ruskin cut up manuscripts. David Lang, quote, honoured them by rebinding them for institutions all over Edinburgh. Which of them did the most?
That is interesting. And I think Elizabeth knows and helped me when I wrote my first dissertation about the rebinding of illuminated manuscripts. And I did cite quite a few Lang manuscripts. And I think between breaking and rebinding, I think the breakers did more to harm the manuscript. Because the breakers, they decontextualized things. They sent them hither and yon, scattered them to the winds to sell them to the highest bidder. People like, oh, what is her name? I can't remember her name, but there's a woman who runs the Medieval Society of America who has worked to put together fragments back into, I believe it's a Psalter that was broken up many years ago, and put it back together, quote unquote, virtually, which is a really cool project that we would not have been able to do 20, 30 years ago. But the rebinders, I mean, you have issues of cropping of pages, which in some examples they crop out marginalia, really important sort of evidence of readers, or they rebind them too tightly so you can hardly open the manuscript. But at least it's all still in one place. A book can be rebound. It's not ideal for the book, but even disbinding a poorly bound illuminated manuscript comes with its own advantages, because once it's disbound, you can even image the front and back of individual leaves or gatherings, or however the book is organized, to make the book even more accessible than it was before. I know there's one particular Lang manuscript that I'm thinking of that is just, it's so thick and it will not open. I don't know what the point of that binding was, other than to, you know, make it look nice on the shelf, because it's clearly not to actually use the book. But it's interesting to sort of compare and contrast which did the most damage, because both of them damaged, definitely. But one, I think, is more irreversible than the other.
I see someone who's put in the chat, the name that you were looking for was Lisa Fagan Davis.
That's it, yes. Yeah, she does amazing things with fragments and reassembly of things that were broken up over the years. And yeah, if you Google her and her manuscript road trip, you can find lots of interesting stories about that sort of thing.
I know there's also the Biblissima project, which is also about exactly these things which have been dispersed all over the place. At least if it's somewhere and it's digitized, there are amazing things that can be done technologically to reunite dispersed manuscripts. Mm-hmm. Whereas I suppose with the binding, if it's cropped, that cropped inch is not coming back.
Yep.
I'll move on to the next question from Julie Gardam. Amazing sweep through so many lovely manuscripts. Thanks, Ali. Heartily agree. Which is your personal favorite book of ours and why?
Oh, that's hard. I think I have a spread of at least one of my favorites, which is University of Edinburgh MS 39, I believe. It's English. It's just, I don't know. It doesn't have this one. Yes. What is this? I can't read it. 310. It just, the borders and the miniatures, I'll zoom in on the miniature. They're incredible. And this isn't English. I was conflating a different book. But I just, it's so like textural. All of that spiky ivy leaf, and I don't know, it's like peering into a thorn bush and seeing a window into the Virgin Mary being told that she would carry Christ, and it's just, it's so cool. And you can see sort of these funny little angels. I'll zoom in on the bottom here. They look like they're doing the limbo or something, like they're progressively getting lower. And it's sort of a restrained sort of border fun. As I mentioned, there are all sorts of shenanigans that happen in the borders, some of it very sort of explicit. But the borders in this manuscript they're restrained, but they're still funny. So like the very last, let me scroll down, very last slide here. This is another miniature border illustration from that manuscript. And like to our modern eyes, this looks very strange and very nonsensical and very silly. And it would have back in the medieval times too, but it's also an illustration of, I think it's training a falcon. So the guy has this little bird hat on, and the bird on the end of the sticks is supposed to be a falcon. It doesn't look much like a falcon, but it's just, I don't know, it's so charming to see these little vignettes in the margins. And that's sort of a normal sort of quarto-ish sized book of hours. It's not small, but it's not huge. I think my other favorite is the Cooper Hewitt manuscript book of hours up in New York, the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt Museum, which is this teensy weensy little Netherlandish book made for a woman. And it's so tiny and so sweet and so, I don't know, it's like a little gem. So between those two, I don't know that I would be able to decide.
Excellent. I think that one, it's so wonderful to be able to look at the digitized images, but it also makes me think how wonderful, you can just see how thick that illumination is, and therefore how different it would be to see that as a physical object, which really would be in
Yes.
but gold is so thick.
Yeah, it is. I know. And it's interesting, you can see in this illumination, especially with the zoomed in, the use of both shell gold and gold leaf. Gold leaf, you can see the really sparkly stuff that is like in these little circles here, which would be applied to a ground and then burnished to a shine. Whereas the shell gold appears on the actual leaves themselves, and they're a bit more dull. And you can also see some shell gold highlighting on that sort of reddish flower there in the corner. So they really pulled out all the stops. They were using every sort of resource that they had. And if I recall correctly, the vellum is just so fine and soft, and it's a beautiful manuscript. I love this thing.
That image of the natural world takes us very nicely into our next question from Joe Marshall. Has anyone researched the aspect you mentioned about these books having some of the first surviving natural history observations, which sounds really interesting?
Yes, and I've actually been putting together an article on it for the past 3 years, but you know how that goes. But other people have done research on this topic. There's I believe he's Netherlandish, who did like a calligraphy pattern book of, you know, just sort of exciting examples of calligraphy. And he also included illuminations that are truly the earliest natural history illustrations. They are taken directly from nature, probably observed from dead birds and butterflies and dragonflies and things like that. Can't remember his name, But other people have published about this as a topic, although they tend to sort of start a little later, which is why I was putting together an article, but maybe I should go back to that. They kind of start in the later 15th century, sort of 16th century, getting into early depictions of animals in print and woodblocks and things like that. Whereas I really want to start that bit earlier in like the early 15th century, and even a little bit in the 14th, because that's when you first start seeing, especially the plants. A lot of attention has been paid to the animals in the margins, but sorry, you can hear my cat crunching around on his paper in the background. But the animals, which are very charismatic, they have a lot of attention on them. But the plants and the flowers, especially, you can really tell what they are down to the species level. So yeah, I need to go back and work on that, but there are works around that sort of deal with it in a way.
I guess at the Smithsonian, you're in just the right place to carry out.
Yeah.
Plenty of experts on hand, I would hope, to help you with the natural history side of it. Our next question is from Tony Woodhams. Fascinating, thank you. You mentioned hierarchy and that rubrication was down the list and illumination was at the top. Would you be able to expand a little on the different levels, please?
Sure, let me hop back to the relevant slides. I've learned all sorts of exciting things about PowerPoint in the course of giving Zoom lectures. So I feel like a real sort of tech whiz now, even though I'm not. But so we have the text, which is, it's the black stuff. And then the initials, which do I have? I have the wall of text and I have this. So here we have, these are what I would call rubricated. Throughout this book, it's just reds and blues. It's nothing else. And you can see even within the text, let me see if I can get my mouse on the screen. If you can see my little hand here, you can see like the section headings here in red. I believe this is a chapter heading in sort of this red and blue, and annotations in the margins. I think these might actually be contemporary to the production of the book, so I'm not sure if they're errors or additional notes. And then further down, we have a nice little repair here. I love this. And then just these sort of decorative rubrications that, you know, you can tell that they are more, they're larger than the regular rubricated text, but they're not, you know, like that giant P. So it's like a quick visual navigation clue because chapters would run into each other. I think the text at the beginning of this page is actually, you know, leftovers from the last chapter. So when browsing your manuscript, you can flip through to, you know, that giant P. I think that's where the section on the St. Peter begins or something like that. So let's go back to this. But the illuminations, they didn't appear in all books. Books of Hours are very well known for having these sort of full page or at least half page illuminations to sort of mark the hour at hand, which follows the cycle of Jesus's life or St. Catherine or something like that, where you have these sort of episodes that mark out the hours. But you didn't always have that for every section. So like the calendar, sometimes it just opens and there's a calendar. You can tell the KL for the calends, that's the opening of the calendar. But the illuminations are really the best markers available because they're huge and they look very different from your run-of-the-mill text, even if you did have margins that were decorated in the same book. So it was really a wayfinding practice to add in rubrication. It's interesting once we start getting into printed history. You get printed books that you had to pay extra for the rubricator to sort of quote unquote finish. But if you didn't pay extra, you would just have a book with big square blanks where letters should be. And you can kind of tell, it really tells you something about the owner of the book, that they either didn't want to spring for the rubricator, or the book was never sold, or something like that. So rubrication is an interesting indicator of a lot of things in manuscript and printed books.
I was looking at an incunable of ours yesterday, in fact, where exactly that happens. It's beautiful blank spaces for you to put illuminations in, but this was a very practical reader who wrote scholarly annotations to waste their time with all that arty nonsense. Our next question from Rosemary Franco: whether particular types of, quote, paper, I guess, whatever the material was, that held pigment better than others across the century.
So I'll just pull this up because it's a nice spread. 99.9% of early books of ours were written on vellum/parchment. Generally, parchment is used as a less fine word, while vellum is a finer material. Both of these are animal skin, usually from cows, but also from sheep or goats. There are also manuscripts written on donkey. I believe there are some written on deer, but it's a particular kind of prepared animal hide. And because it's from an animal, there are two sides to vellum. You have the hair side, which is the side that the hair was on, literally, and the flesh side, which is the inside of the animal. The hair side, you can usually see, depending on the animal, you can see more pores, more coloration, sort of evidence that the animal was once an animal and not just a book. While on the flesh side, it's generally smoother. The hair side, it's hard to describe. The hair side is more velvety. It's not like, it's like a very short sort of velvet. It's not that rich sort of, fuzzy, but it definitely has a sort of fuzz to it. While the flesh side is generally very, very, very smooth. So I think the hair side was a bit more difficult to write on and illuminate on, just due to the texture and sort of the fiber that was part of the skin, while the flesh side was more ideal. But once you get to paper, there was a lot of sort of experimentation of sizing and things like that that caused the ink to not get completely sucked up into the paper, but to absorb a little bit, and also to sit on top of the page and not, bleed. Yeah, I've heard that sheep is a bit greasier when it comes to parchment, and it might not be as desirable as, say, cow or something like that. But in terms of different animals, that's all I've really heard. But between paper and vellum, in the early days when paper came to Europe, it was thought of as sort of like a dirty thing that Eastern peoples and Muslim people used, that was made of nasty old rags. It was. And it had a lesser reputation than good old-fashioned European vellum. But as it became obvious that this was a cheaper alternative to vellum, it sort of, the tables turned for paper and vellum, and paper became the more acceptable medium for manuscript and then print. I know Gutenberg Bibles were printed on both paper and vellum. The deluxe ones were on vellum, and they had to use two different ink formulations, I believe, or the ink, print ink does not stick to vellum as well as it sticks to paper. It's formulated specifically for paper, whereas, the sort of liquid calligraphy ink, it's not as tacky, it doesn't need to stick to the type. So they have different assets and attributes.
Gutenberg's ink, I think, is amazingly fantastic. You can see it behind me, I think. But it's slightly different, I think, to how it developed as printing became more widespread. The next question, well, it's a comment from Graham Lyle, but I'm sure you could speak to this. Perhaps some readers could not in fact read, but could enjoy the book.
So this is really interesting, and I'm going to either show my Americanness or my Britishness. I can't figure out where I got this pronunciation from. But primers or primers, they are so called because they are based on the hour of prime, the first sort of named hour of the day in which you would say your prayers. These were actually teaching tools for children. A lot of books of hours were made for women whose early job was to educate the offspring of themselves and their husband. And so the only book they often had around to do that was their book of hours. So it was easy to help the child to understand what was going on, even while they recited their prayers without knowing how to read their prayers necessarily. It helped as an educational tool. Let me pull up another opening. Let's just do this slide. So this is obviously a beautiful example. I don't know if a child would have looked at this one. But yeah, so they functioned as educational aids. Generally, if people couldn't read, they weren't a member of the merchant class or the middle class, because in order to sell stuff, generally you needed to know how to read at least a little. But lower classes who would go to church and see these grand breviaries or missals or graduals, the gigantic music books that choirs sang from, they needed to be so big, of course, because not every singer could have an individual manuscript. They all needed to sort of stand back from the manuscript and be able to see it where the director was standing. So if they caught a glimpse of things like that when they went to church, they would be able to say, aha, we're reading about the temptation of Christ, or we're doing this passage today. So yeah, between being used as an early childhood education tool and as sort of a memory spur for people who might not be as literate, they were definitely used as that. And you can argue that image literacy is not the same as language literacy, but there was a lot more image literacy in the Middle Ages than there was written word literacy. They might not be able to read the prayer that comes underneath the Annunciation, but they would know it by heart and be able to sort of recite it when presented with an image of the Annunciation.
I've just realized I left a question out from B. Williams Ellertson. Is there information about who and how space within a book was allocated? Did the scribe decide which passages got a full page illustration, for example?
And I sort of touched on this in response to an earlier question, but generally the hours each got a full page illustration depending on the quality of the book. The Psalms would usually get something smaller. The Gospels would often have larger illuminated initials that feature the different writers of the Gospels and their sort of patron animals. Those are always fun to look at. And it depended on the quality of the book. As I mentioned, these were not cheap, but they were relatively cheap if they were less illuminated. So generally the practice was to have each hour have at least some of an illumination, but the rest of it might not have any. It might just have decorative initials, rubrication, things like that, but the hours might be the only things that are illuminated. Whereas the more deluxe manuscripts, sometimes even the calendars have illuminated sections. They don't have full page illuminations, but they have what are called the labors of the month, where you have the sort of the common folk laboring in the field, doing the different things that you should do during different months. In October, you're supposed to crush grapes. I think in December, you're supposed to shake the acorns out of the tree to feed your hogs. So they have all sorts of funny little illustrations like that, as well as, interestingly, the zodiac. But your lower end books of hours and manuscripts didn't have that level of detail.
The next question is a really fascinating one from David Allen. Speaking of the illuminations of the text enhancing the experience, since they were used in a world lit by sunlight and fire, were the illuminations for evening prayers by firelight more bright or dazzling? How would a fire dance off an illumination to contribute to the trance?
Yeah, so a lot of people sort of refer to the illuminated manuscripts in terms of, like I mentioned, that gold or silver leaf. Where the sparkling of the candlelight or the firelight would really make them incandescent almost, and it brings the dynamism to the literal world, that, you know, this book it's moving in a way, because the light is reflecting off of it and hitting it differently in different ways. I don't know actually if the evening illuminations were more illuminated, quote unquote, to take advantage of that firelight and the reflective effect. That is an interesting sort of point that I had never considered before. But that's why they used as much gold leaf as they did throughout the book, because even during the day, if you're a monk in a monastery, or if you're a noble in your personal chapel, there are windows, but they're not always, you know, working. It might be cloudy, as it often is in the UK, or you know, in Northern Europe. So candles would be an ever-present sort of presence in the reading of books. You actually often find drips of wax in medieval manuscripts and even early printed books, where you can tell that someone was, you know, leaning over it with their candle and a little splooch just fell off. That's always interesting to find.
There are two more questions, and I'll also just point out, Bridget Weirty has kindly put the link to the manuscript road trip.
Yes, thank you, Bridget.
So the next question from B. Williams Elliotson: have any of the pattern books survived? I'd be fascinated to see what models the illuminators worked from.
So I know of two later pattern books that survive at the University of Glasgow Library. They're not, I'm trying to remember, they're more calligraphy patterns and initials rather than patterns for the miniatures, but they do have also border patterns and things in them that are interesting to reference. I don't know that any whole pattern book survives because they were used to pieces. There was a practice called pouncing, which you can see in some manuscripts, where you would actually have it's like carving a pumpkin or something, where you would put the exemplar page on top of a blank piece of vellum and actually poke little holes sort of around the figures. So you had a guide to draw your figures without actually having to draw them from scratch. But that implies that, you know, these were loose sheets that might have been sort of put in a folder or stacked up or something like that, that they might not have even been bound. So they would have been very easy to sort of lose over the years, especially when the Renaissance came along and all of a sudden, like, that style of art was sort of out the window in some areas. They were just not as valuable, or they were out of date, or they thought they were crude, so they just threw them away. But there are some other pattern books that are incomplete that survive in other collections. Like I said, I only know specifically of the two Glasgow ones, but I know there are a few others around that contain pattern-like information.
Excellent. And our final question, and it's a great one to end on, from Daryl. Go on, tell us about your favorite binding on a book of ours.
Oh boy, I'm torn. there are some fabulous bindings on books of hours, between the contemporary ones that have managed to survive through to today. They really show that these books were a treasured part of collections and sort of family heirlooms. And even some of the more modern rebindings are very interesting. As Daryl well knows, I am a big fan of Douglas Cockrell and Son. It was an English bookbinder that operated in Letchworth, based on Douglas Cockrell worked closely with William Morris and sort of the arts and crafts movement, and based a lot of his binding styles and binding materials on that sort of aesthetic and concept, and it carried on to his son Sidney. And he did a lot of commissions for both the University of Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow, rebinding manuscripts and incunabula in sort of the mid to late-ish 20th century, like 50s to the 70s generally. But even then, it really has this really sort of rich arts and crafts aesthetic to it. So I don't know, I really love those. They're very plain. I think that that's what's so charming about modern rebindings to me is that, you know, in the 19th century, if you had a 14th or 15th century book of hours, you would usually have some overambitious bookbinder try to bind it in Gothic revival style and just throw a bunch of metal furniture on it and gild the crap out of it. And it looks, I don't know, it's like a sugared plum or something, that it's too sweet. And the sort of plainer modern bindings, they let the manuscript speak. It's sort of, you know, it says, this is a modern binding. We're not going to try to emulate what was in the past. It won't be as valuable for research as a true contemporary binding of this manuscript would be. So we're going to let the history take center stage and not try to fake, you know, a fabulous medieval binding. You do get people being creative with their rebindings to certain extents. And of course you can commission any sort of binding you want. If you are the lucky owner of a medieval manuscript, you can have it completely decked out in furniture and velvet and horn windows and whatever else you want. But I really appreciate that a lot of public collections like libraries have gone for the more understated, respectful sort of rebindings. Both the University of Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow have real stunners. I think my favorite binding is not actually on a book of hours at all. It's on a book at the University of Edinburgh. I can't remember if it's a gradual or a missal. It's a big book of music. I know the university uses the illuminated piper from that book on a lot of sort of stationery and promotional materials. But it's a big book because it's a music book, and it has a lot of contemporary furniture, metal bosses. I think one of the clasps is still there. And something that I'm really a fan of is a horn window, which I mentioned sort of as a throwaway remark just a second ago. But because until really the 17th century, a lot of books tended to be stored flat rather than, you know, on a shelf with the spine out as we think of books being stored. Either the titles would be written on the foredge or the tail or the head, or even just slap on the front of the book. And that is what the horn window is for. It's a very thin piece of horn that actually protects, I think it's a little slip of vellum or parchment or something that actually has the title of the book on it. And it's just, it's really ticks all the boxes. And unfortunately the spine is a little loose, but even that is sort of a positive thing, because you can sort of peek in and see the structure of the book, which is always really interesting. And it really, you can see the materials that were used, how the gatherings were attached to each other, what it was sewn on. So I really like that book. I don't know if Daryl has played with it recently, but it's a good one.
Thank you. And I think it's really appropriate after you've shown us so much about the inside of books that finally you show us a little window on the outside. I know exactly what you mean, little windows through which you can see the horn labels. So Ali, thank you so much for this talk. It has been really wonderful. And I think you can have seen from all the questions just how much interest it excited. Just before we finish, a couple more things. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us from all around the world, wherever you are. And do come back. As I said at the beginning, our next talk is on the 21st of January. Professor Kirsty Blair, local all over the world, Scottish writing and the popular newspaper press. If you're a member of the society, as ever, you'll get details of that via email. If not, you'll be able to book it via Eventbrite in the same way as you were able with this talk. But I would encourage everybody, join EBS. It's really cheap. £18 for an individual, and for that, if you join now, you will get our journal, which is in fact this year's volume is just about to come out, so you'll be just in time to join it. And speaking of that, I would also like to say a very special thank you to Andrew McAinch, the journal editor, who has been our technical host this evening and done all the data wrangling to make sure this talk went extremely smoothly. And with that, just once again, thanks to Ali. We can't give you a round of applause, but people know how to use the reactions button. Do feel free to use the reactions button to put the little yellow hands of clapping hands up to show your appreciation for Ali's talk. Thank you so much. It's been really great. And with that, we'll draw, well, our evening, I guess your afternoon to a close.
Yeah.
If you were here in Edinburgh, we could take you for a drink. But next time we're able to voyage across the Atlantic. Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you again for having me. Happy holidays, happy first day of Hanukkah, and I hope you all have a nice evening or afternoon.
Thanks.